Setting all politics and religion aside, let's see what science has to say about whether an embryo and a fetus are considered alive. In biology, we define life according to 7 key characteristics. Those are response, order, growth, energy, evolution, regulation, and reproduction, or Roger for short. But before we continue on, welcome to the Decanta channel, where we discuss all things educational and we never duck away from the difficult topics. Subscribe to support free, quality educational content and to stay in the know. Do your part by watching one full episode and expressing your like or dislike in the comments below. Now back to that first characteristic. It must be able to respond to its environment. Take sunflowers, for example. When they're still babies, their heads move back and forth to follow the sun across the sky every single day. Clearly a response to their environment. When a female becomes pregnant, her one fertilized egg cell divides to become 2, those 2 divide to become 4, and those 4 divide to become 8, and so on and so forth. Between days 6 and 10, that ball of cells, or the blastocyst, implants into the wall of the uterus of the mother. Yet another clear example of a response to environment. A study published in the Journal of Child Health stated that response to touch develops in a human fetus from 8 weeks onwards. And a separate study published in the National Library of Medicine showed that a human fetus could respond to sound as early as 16 weeks. That's before the ears are even fully developed yet. Every step of the way, from fertilization to birth, the developing human responds to the environment around it. The next characteristic that life must have is called order. Take a look at this pine cone, for example. The order of the wood scales is quite apparent and obvious, but what might not be as obvious is the seed that is at the base of each of these scales. And even less obvious, if we were to zoom in with a microscope, is that each one of those seeds is composed of cells, which is the simplest unit of life that we know of, and the simplest unit of order as well. Every single cell in each seed contains the genetic information, i.e. the DNA, to make a pine tree, given the optimal environment to do so, of course. And as I just mentioned, the cells are the structural, fundamental, and simplest unit that make up all living things as we know it. And since an embryo, and likewise a fetus, are made of cells, we can give this category of order a great big thumbs up. Moving on to that next category, growth. Although these pine seeds are in a dormant state right now, if I was to, say, plant them and water them, the cells in each seed would begin to rapidly divide and grow. During that growth process, the DNA from each cell will get copied and pasted into the newly formed cell, which is the overall process that allows the seed to grow into a giant pine tree and a little microscopic sperm cell and egg cell to grow into you and me. We know that the genetic information inside these seeds is just for a pine tree. So if I was to plant those seeds, it would grow a pine tree and not, say, a sunflower. Likewise, we know that human cells contain human DNA. So if we were to allow a developing human to continue to grow, it would grow into a human. Also, not a pine tree or a sunflower. And of course, if there's one really good thing that an embryo and a fetus are good at, it's growth. Next in line is the ability to use energy. The baby sunflowers I mentioned before turn their heads towards the sun every single day in order for them to be able to create their own food in a process called photosynthesis. I'm sure you've heard of it. When the flowers absorb the sunlight, they create and use a chemical form of energy known as ATP. We as humans, and pretty much all other life on planet Earth, including lions, leeches, and ladybugs, use this chemical form of energy, ATP, too. However, unlike the sunflowers, we actually have to eat our food source in order to obtain the ATP, or suck the blood out of a host to acquire the nutrient-packed plasma in the case of a leech. Even though we acquire the ATP energy differently, animals, plants, fungi are still able to obtain the energy and utilize it. from all of their unique sources. Now, a fetus is connected to the placenta, which is connected to the mother via the umbilical cord. The umbilical cord blood vessels transfer all of the nutrients and oxygen necessary for the fetus to develop and in order for the fetus to obtain energy for the growth of the cells. Now, how an organism acquires its energy source is inconsequential to this category of life. What's important here is that it has the ability to utilize that energy, which a fetus is perfectly capable of doing, just like any fully developed human is able to do. The next characteristic is the ability to experience evolution. I know some may cringe or some may celebrate at the word evolution and what they feel that word may imply. But in biology, evolution is simply defined as a change in genes over time. Whether you believe in a divine creator or the Big Bang, one thing is for certain: our genes, our DNA, does change over time. In fact, all life as we know it has variations in DNA, and that's what makes us unique, adaptable, and capable of living. There are many things that can cause evolution to occur, but the most important one in terms of a fetus is called recombination. Recombination, in very simple terms, is basically the process where your mom's DNA and your dad's DNA was all put in a blender and then randomly pieced back together to make your sperm if you're a male or your egg cells if you're a female. Your sperm or your egg cells DNA is completely different than the DNA throughout the rest of your entire body, nor is it the same as your parents' DNA. It is completely different. So literally then, the creation of sperm and egg cells through recombination is an act of evolution. And since both a sperm and an egg cell are required to make a fetus, we can say that an embryo and likewise a fetus are capable of evolution and fulfill this category. Now, in order to be considered alive, an organism must also fulfill the category of regulation. In other words, the object in question must be able to regulate a steady state of conditions. For example, this could be your body temperature, your blood sugar levels, your blood pressure, and your blood oxygen, just to name a few. Your body does all of these forms of regulation without you even thinking about it, and all of that regulation keeps you alive. Now, a fetus does rely on its mother to regulate its body temperature until birth, and even after birth, since babies can lose heat as much as 4 times as fast as adults can. But just because the fetus relies on the mother for that temperature regulation doesn't mean it's incapable of its own regulation. For example, the amniotic sac that surrounds the embryo and the fetus is created by the fetus and helps protect it, keeping it in a kind of liquidy state, which helps regulate that temperature of the fetus. Well, but what would happen if the cord was obstructed, limiting the oxygen flow to the fetus then? The fetus experiences a rapid increase in body temperature, but the brain temperature of the fetus tends to remain constant. This demonstrates that the fetus is capable of regulating its own brain temperature in order to protect its brain from damage if the cord were to be obstructed, at least for a period of time. A human embryo also creates a yolk sac that supplies nourishment to the embryo until about the 10th week. At that point, we would call an embryo a fetus anyways, and from there on forwards, the nourishment would be coming from the placenta. Now, the fetus creates and controls the placenta during development, and the placenta itself regulates that nutrient absorption and produces numerous hormones, many of which regulate fetal growth. So when considering the amniotic sac, the cord, the yolk sac, and the placenta, all organs created by the embryo, we can say that both an embryo and a fetus are capable of regulation. And then there's the last characteristic of life, my personal favorite, the ability to reproduce. Yes, we're talking the birds and the bees here, the hoochie coochie hanky panky, and we can joke about it till we're blue in the face, but in reality, the ability to reproduce, to pass on our genes, is hardwired into our DNA because it's a fundamental necessity in order for life to continue. And it's the reason why we desire to have sex in the first place. Passing on our DNA from parent to child ensures our survival as a species, whether that's from the perspective of a hermaphroditic earthworm creating the next generation of earthworms, or a bee transferring pollen from one sunflower to the next to create the next generation of sunflower seeds. Now, although an embryo doesn't have fully developed developed sex organs yet, every embryo, excluding those with an obvious disorder, has an XX chromosome, that's the instructions to make female parts, or an XY chromosome, the instructions to make male parts. Simply by having the genetic capability of reproduction, by possessing the XX for female or XY chromosome for male, in order to develop a vagina or a penis, respectively, means that the category for reproduction for a fetus gets a giant thumbs up. Now that we've gone through the whole Roger acronym, it seems like there's a clear conclusion to our initial question. But just because science says a fetus is alive doesn't mean that it can encompass the full complexity of this topic. Sometimes science can be black and white, but from a political perspective, this is quite the gray area, since the fetus's right to life may interfere with the woman's right to bodily autonomy. But by applying the characteristics of Roger, it is easy to determine if something is considered alive or not. In this case, both an embryo and a fetus are 100% considered alive from a scientific standpoint. Please share your personal view for the following question in the comments below. When is it acceptable to stop a human life from developing? For now, we'll have to leave it up to politics to decide on the matter. These videos take quite a bit of time for me to make, and it'll only cost you 1 second to either like or dislike this video. To join me next week in the Super Simplified Science of Pregnancy series, all you have to do is subscribe. Thanks for watching, and see you again next week.